So first and foremost, congratulations. It's been a little bit of time, but you've parlayed, no doubt, a lot of your dreams and hopes into a successful career. So, looking at it now, a decade later, first and foremost, what's the first word that comes to your mind, Adam, about your next?
I don't know if I could sum it up in one word, but I mean, definitely Your Next was the movie that kicked off everything for me, like the going into it, the goal was to see if we could make a horror film that could both meet our sensibilities as filmmakers at where we were as indie filmmakers, but also do something that was accessible to a mainstream audience. And so it's really gratifying. I guess gratifying would be the word, is what I would say, because that's, it's been a long journey, but Your Next was the one that kind of opened the doors to having a career in this industry for me, more than anything.
You and Simon come from very humble roots. You weren't raised out on either coast, which there's definitely a difference. I've been in Jersey all my life, Adam, and it's different than heading out to Ohio, for example, just this past weekend. How did your roots and Simon's roots, if you'd like to speak to it as well, how did your roots really form you as a filmmaker and lead into something like Your Next? How did it shape it?
Well, it's interesting because like the first two movies that I did with Simon were both in his hometown, Columbia, Missouri. So that rubbed off on us a lot. I'm from not too far from there, but I'm from the deep South, Alabama, which really is very similar in a lot of ways to the Midwest. Like the South has its own roots and history that pulls you in different directions, obviously, but there's a very much a similarity in terms of your isolation and those kind of things. And if I had to sum it up, I would say the isolation element of it is really kind of the most inspiring of it all, because when you're just kind of out there, in the middle of nowhere, you're kind of left to your own devices. There's not like this kind of competitive vibe. I didn't know any other filmmakers growing up. And so like I was kind of free from those sort of distractions. I felt like I was like the only person in the world doing this sometimes. But ultimately a movie like Your Next really comes from that kind of sense of isolation. I remember right before talking to Simon about doing this film, I was sitting around my house in Alabama, and I was trying to figure out like what really scares me these days, because I felt like I was just so desensitized to horror. I'd just seen so many horror movies that just nothing scared me anymore. I was just completely numb to it all. It used to be like ghost stories, supernatural things that used to really frighten me a lot. I grew up in a haunted house out in Alabama, like it was built in the 1800s. My backyard was a cemetery. So like I really related to those stories, but I just kind of like beat them to death. I just watched too many of them. And even that kind of lost its appeal. But really at the end of the day, it was like there was a string of home invasion movies that came out in the mid to late 2000s that started really hitting me and making me feel terrified again. And I'd say the first one that I saw was a French film called Them. Like really great movie, extremely underrated. People kind of don't even really talk about it these days, but at the time that was one that really kicked it off for me. Just the mood, the atmosphere, the tone. Obviously The Strangers, here in the US, that movie came out just before the 2010s, and I remember watching that home alone. I don't think I saw it in the theater, but when I saw it at home, I was just, it took me a couple watches to get through it, because I was, it was just very relatable. It was like, you could just picture that happening to you, just being out there in the woods and having, nobody to help you, And so that's what kind of kicked it off. I started talking to Simon about wanting to do a home invasion thing, and we went from there.
And that's one thing I've noticed more in the research and due diligence before speaking with you and Simon is I feel like it's a lot more modern influences in filmmakers rather than the classics. And a lot of times the filmmakers, especially indie and the bubble go, oh, well, I pulled from Craven and Carpenter and Dario Argento and stuff. It doesn't seem like you guys were influenced. I'm sure there was some influence from the classics, but it seems more like the modern stuff. Would have a classic influence or set of influences shaped it differently?
At the time, I was like very much into the idea of modern horror in a way, like I was very influenced by all the classic horror. Those are all my favorite movies. And, you can see some really obvious inspirations from Nightmare on Elm Street and
Right.
in The Guest. I know Simon was extremely influenced by a lot of other classic horror films. But like, I think at the time there was just this feeling of like, okay, well, everybody else is kind of doing that, in the 2010s, that was the era of Grindhouse and Cabin Fever and those kind of things. And so it was really kind of a very popular thing to do, to look back at the nostalgic eras and the Rob Zombie stuff. And I was really enjoying all that shit. And
Right.
but at the end of the day, like I said, I think Your Next came from a place of like, can we make something scary? Which ultimately, I don't actually think Your Next is a very scary movie, but I do think that but it is something that's very inspired by modern cinema. And like I said, it really came from the home invasion things, and really like Simon and I were really into the mumblecore movement, which
Right.
we got lumped into eventually just by working with Joe Swanberg a lot. And my roots, coming up with a film called Pop Skull, which was an almost totally improvisational film, and eventually the mumblecore thing, once it got mixed with genre, people started calling it mumble gore, kind of tongue in cheek. And that became sort of our contribution to the movement. And we saw Your Next, I think, ultimately as something that was kind of melding a very new movement in cinema, which was mumblecore, with a very old movement in cinema, which is horror, and with inspirations within home invasion things. And if you look at Your Next, the reason why I think it's such an interesting film and such a timestamp in time is that it's not just that we had those influences, but we brought them very literally on screen in the film. I mean, like Ty West is in the movie, who's also associated with that. Amy Simons, who we'd worked with and who had done a bunch of mumblecore things. Joe Swanberg. I mean, at the time, like Joe Swanberg was not associated with horror whatsoever. I mean, like he was very much a straight kind of, drama, comedy kind of mumblecore filmmaker. And we wanted to bring all those influences into the film and create something that felt very like of the time. And I think that's really ultimately what kind of helped the movie kind of stand out. Even if you weren't familiar with those movements,
Right.
I think you can tell that there was something else going on here other than just us going, okay, we're going to deconstruct horror again, because, ultimately that's been done before this and after this a million times. And, how many times can you point out,
Right.
all the tropes in horror? It's like, we were always kind of like, everybody, like when the movie first came out, that was sort of the talking point that, it's like another Scream, we're another movie that's, deconstructing horror in a meta way. But if you really look at Your Next, I mean, the characters are never deconstructing horror, really. Like they're not talking about it. They're not like talking about, well, if this was a horror film, we just do a lot of the horror tropes, and we do them in a really fun way. And I think that the film winks at the audience without having to overtly declare that.
It's really interesting because a few years ago I was lucky enough to go up to TIFF, but I've been a staple at Fantastic Fest the last, I guess, now 5 out of 6 years, not counting COVID. And those audiences really, you having the world premiere there and the US premiere at Fantastic Fest, those audiences get in front of it, and it's key for those audiences. They eat it up. I mean, it's insanity with the midnight audience, with just the Austin audience in general, and all the amazing people that come through. How important was it to get in front of audiences like that? And was it one of the lead factors, especially with TIFF, why Lionsgate ended up picking up the film?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, still one of the best screenings I've ever had was at the Midnight Madness screening of Your Next at TIFF. I mean, as a matter of fact, I mean, like right after I walked off stage, like I don't even think I was off stage, and Jason Constantine from Lionsgate met me right at the stairs and was like shaking my hand, and he was giving me his business card right away. Like they were all over it, and they immediately gave us the best deal going forward. It's a movie for horror fans more than anything. I mean, like it's a film that kind of summarizes all of our interest within horror. I don't know. It was always meant to be a movie that was going to play for an audience. Like I said, like up to that point, like Simon and I had done a lot of very kind of experimental films. Like everything we had done was so low budget. I mean, Your Next was very low budget itself. It was between $500,000 and $700,000 ultimately. But everything before that was even much lower, less than 100,000, sometimes less than 5,000. And so when you're working at that low budget, you can't just point the camera at things and show things and let things play out, because it's just going to look really cheap. You don't have the resources to make it work. So you have to constantly think in very creative ways on how to make a movie stand out on its own merits, even if you don't have the money for it. And so that meant that a lot of the filmmaking stylization was very experimental. And after a while, I started feeling like that was kind of a crutch, that I wasn't allowing myself to tell the stories to their fullest potential, because I had to tell them in very specific ways just to get them on screen and make them palatable to watch. And so Your Next was the first time where we're like, okay, for us, $500,000 feels like an absolute fortune. So we felt like we got all the money in the world, and now it's time to see, like, can we just tell a story in a relatively straightforward way? And even though Your Next, I wouldn't say is a totally straightforward film, that was the feeling that we had at the time. Can we use more conventional film language to get it out there? And this was the first movie also that that we had ever tested for an audience, or at least it was for me. So I'd never done an audience recruit screening. Our producers, Keith and Jess Calder, were very all about that.
Right.
And so we went out to like Culver City or Hollywood somewhere, I don't remember, and we did an official recruit screening. And I remember just being like, oh, this is awful. I felt like just like any filmmaker, you're suspicious that, like, do the producers have motives? Do they secretly want us to cut a bunch of stuff and they're going to use this as like an excuse to do that? And so I went into that process very skeptical. Honestly, that screening might have even been more exciting than the TIFF screening, because our expectations were so low, and it was a very diverse crowd. It wasn't just like horror fans. It was just like totally normal people of all different walks of life. When the movie got going, people were like literally standing up and cheering and yelling, and it was a very rowdy screening, and not what we expected. I mean, all the way up to the ending of the film, whenever, the cop shoots Aaron and that whole bit, like everybody was just going nuts over that, so whenever that happened and we're like in a test screening and we had this great audience feedback, that's when it was like, we were really charged up. We're like, oh shit, like, I think we actually like are onto something here. And so that was really exciting.
I didn't like the film at the beginning. I was just not a fan, but I grew to love the film. And it's been one of my favorite films for the past 7-8 years. And I was there, and that screening at the drive-in with this mask right here, my fiance wearing the lamb mask, I came to love the film. And, that's one of the things that I believe Your Next will always be, at least in the modern landscape. It'll be a film that found its audience, found its cult audience. So how important is the word of mouth and gaining that cult status, even though you ran to turbulence on your way there?
When I think about all my favorite movies, I kind of had a similar experience to you, which is like a lot of my favorite movies I didn't like the first time I saw them.
Right.
I mean, when I saw The Shining, it took me like 3 or 4 times to watch it before I actually liked it, and now it's like my favorite movie. And and that's almost across the board. Every film that I would say is in my like top 5. I was either lukewarm to or just flat out didn't like. I mean, one of my favorite movies of all time is this Takeshi Kitano film called Hanabi. And the first time I watched it, I fast forwarded through half of it because I was so fucking bored. And then like weirdly, it clicked in at some point, when I rewatched it or something. I think having the longevity of a film is way more important than the immediate gratification. I mean, all you have to do is look at the current landscape of the way people react to movies. It's like there's such hyperbole, on Twitter. It's like every movie that comes out is either the worst or the absolute best.
Right.
And one way or the other. They're kind of like, they either stick around or they're like completely forgotten, within, one movie cycle. And so you can't really trust that kind of knee-jerk reaction, because everybody wants to have that great like moment of discovery or of condemnation towards the film. And and I even look at like the history, not to put the movie down, but like, like the movie that inspired me quite a bit going into this was, like I said, The Strangers. And weirdly, The Strangers has not had quite as good of a legacy. I mean, I think maybe because the movie is a bit more straightforward. I think it's technically a much better made film than Your Next, but I think that Your Next like has something that keeps people, coming back a little bit more and visiting an old friend. I think that's what a good movie kind of feels like. And so I think that the gratification that I get from making a film really derives more from, like you're saying, that kind of longevity thing. And I think Your Next and The Guest specifically have garnered that. And one of my favorite filmmakers is John Carpenter, obviously, and he's a filmmaker who definitely lives in that world. I mean, like I felt like we went through like almost a decade where we all kind of just wrote off John Carpenter's movies entirely, and then suddenly, back in the 2010s, everybody suddenly clicked in and realized again, like, wait a minute, like, They Live is ahead of its time. Prince of Darkness is something people kind of slept on, like, obviously, like, he's just made some of the best movies of all time, but it kind of took a long time for people to really fully come around and accept that and realize that. And it's that longevity thing that really comes in there.
And that's one of the films, Adam, Your Next is one of the films, when someone asks me about a film as kind of a gateway to watching horror, it's perfect in so many ways. And I know for you and for Simon and those involved, you see the flaws, you see the problems with it, but you also see the joy that it brings to people and the fun that you guys had on. Even with the toothache, you had fun on it. Yeah. It's definitely something that's there. And I think one of the reasons also is the grassroots movement that was there in Lionsgate and how they handled it when they put it out. But there was a section of time between there, a good 2 years for it. Can you talk about how you felt during that time in waiting, in anticipation, and whatever feelings you want to throw out there for the film to finally get out to a mainstream audience after, the journey, the festival, and then hopefully getting out to the general public?
Yeah, it was frustrating because, here we were with our big, crowd pleasing movie, and Lionsgate bought it, promised a theatrical thing. And ultimately, they were bought by Summit, I believe. And the Summit had their own slate of films, including the Scott Derrickson movie. I can't remember the name of it. But they had like a priority of slate that they had to put in front of ours. And unfortunately, like you mentioned, that put us coming out after The Purge, and I'll never forget, like, going to, I knew, like, I can't remember what movie we were going to see, but I knew somehow that Your Next was probably going to have a trailer before it. And so I was like really excited, went there with Simon, and, we sat down, and the first trailer that comes on is The Purge. And it was like, oh shit, what is this? Like another home invasion thing with masks and stuff. And then our trailer plays second. And so we look like this like rip off of The Purge or some shit. And so it was like, great, just awesome. But, I mean, for me, more than anything, I guess at the time, it was kind of like that 2 years that it took for the movie to come out was just sort of like putting my career on hold, because I couldn't move to that next phase until the movie came out and did its thing. And also, like, I wasn't going to get like any kind of like, because I don't think Simon and I made any money when we actually shot Your Next. I think our actual paycheck was like basically nothing. And so the money that I would receive would only be, available to me once the movie kind of, because we did have a good sell with Lionsgate. So I was like owed money, but it wasn't until the film came out. And so there's also that just kind of like desperation element where you're like, okay, how do I float through until, this comes through? And fortunately, we had a great relationship with our producers on Your Next, Keith and Jess Calder. And so they were able to fund, or not fund, but yeah, the only thing they did, they put together The Guest with us. And so we were shooting The Guest, you know, in 2013. Like our very last day of shooting actually was the day that Your Next came out. So that kept us busy a little bit in 2013. It was a real weird time because it just felt like everything was on hold. I think that's why we did VHS 2, because we just needed something to do to fill the gap. Yeah, that was a weird kind of purgatory that we were in.
Well, you bring up The Guest, and also at Your Next, your antagonists have a presence, a charisma to them, whether it's the visual presentation, the costuming, which I know you've talked a lot before about Emma's talents, the idea of how they move, how it's shot, the super close-ups. You know, there's a lot of different factors that build that. But watching the film as many times as I have, every time I watch it, whether you're looking at Z, whether you're looking at Charney's character of Wendy, whether you're looking at the actual, you know, the trio, whatever it is, or you look later on with The Guest, you want to root for the villain in it because you realize how amazing they are. And again, there's a whole, depending on how your connection is to people, there's a whole set of reasons for that as well. But talk about, you know, you and Simon cultivating antagonists and why in your films with them, there's something that we want to root for and watch them, you know, cause this chaos, among other things.
Yeah, I don't know why that is necessarily. You know, I think it's just like we like characters, and those end up being the most interesting. And I think to a certain degree we're kind of seduced by them, you know, in the production as well. I mean, Your Next and The Guest, it was like, you know, the villains are just so fun to shoot that you can't help but just enjoy it. And, you know, and I think like as a filmmaker, I'm also an audience member. And so I'm sitting there on set just really enjoying that and kind of feeding into it. And
Right.
And it's funny because it's kind of like a catch-22 thing, because ultimately, you know, the more you do that, the less scary those villains are.
Right.
And so you have to kind of accept that. But also I think that, you know, it's like we've seen a million scary villains, you know, and ultimately it's like, you know, it's fun to have fun with them to a certain degree, you know. Like I wouldn't say that we ever like try to make our villains the heroes of the story necessarily.
It doesn't matter though. You root for
it doesn't matter. Yeah, exactly. I mean, The Guest even more so, because
yeah,
that's a movie where it doesn't even matter that he's the villain. You're just having so much fun with him that you as the audience are seduced by him exactly the same way that the characters in the film are.
Yeah, you got behind the camera a lot for Your Next. The ability to do a super close-up. Talk to me about the fact of using the super close-up in Your Next, because that's so important in so many sequences within that film.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of filmmakers like have like kind of a weird philosophy about the, you know, close-up. I mean, you know, I was talking to my producers recently because we were doing a 4K color transfer of the Guest, and there's a couple scenes in that film as well that have some extreme close-ups. And, you know, they were talking about how much they love this, and they'd worked on some other films where the DPs felt like that, well, an extreme close-up is for TV and the medium shot is more cinematic or whatever. And I actually kind of disagree with that. It's like, you know, it doesn't actually matter. What matters is what's going on screen. And sometimes the medium shot reveals things in the performance that are less interesting, you know, and the extreme close-up, you know, I've always loved like Tony Scott movies and, you know, filmmakers that really get in there. I mean, if you look at Tarantino too, even like he has a lot of wide shots, but he will go in for those like uncomfortably close-ups, you know, that really just, they kind of jar you into the moment. I can't explain why, you know, I'm attracted to that. I mean, I think to a certain degree on Your Next, I'm sure, you know, part of the reason why I was doing it as well was a bit of a authenticity thing, you know, like sometimes, again, like on a low budget movie, you see too much and you start picking apart, you know, issues with it. Sometimes you get really close up, and if you have a good performance, then it can draw you in and it becomes production value in itself. I think it's like important not to have too strong of a philosophy in terms of like going into things saying, oh, well, an extreme close-up is this or that. You know, it's kind of like you have to kind of feel it out a lot of the times, and be flexible to it. And because a lot of these film philosophies really, they're very trendy, you know, like people, you know, if you look at different eras in film, I mean, it's why you look at like movies in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and they all have a different aesthetic, but there's a consistency within those aesthetics. And it's because there's these trends that come through where somebody says, like, if we shoot it this way, it gives this effect. The medium's changing, like, the theatrical experience versus the TV experience, and what people think is one or the other. And now we live at a point where the TV experience is just as theatrical as the film experience. And so, it's kind of muddied the waters in that respect.
It's interesting you talk theory like that. During COVID, I got into film school, and I went back. I've been in the industry for a while, but I went back, and it's so crazy, sitting there at my age. I'm 44. At my age, listening to how you read a book by Walter Murch about editing, and then you look at it and listen to the professors who are working professionals, and they're talking about how things are cut and how close they are TV to film. And you're right, it's changed so much, and the size of the screen, the aspect of you're dealing with pixels, so many different things. And that's one of the things that they talk a lot about is shooting, being a filmmaker with an editorial eye. And you're exactly that. I mean, you're next, you're working on the film as you're going along. How much did the film change with you being on there and in every single aspect of it?
Well, I think it's important that, nowadays filmmakers, do have a foundation in editing, because why not? I mean, it's not like we're working on flatbeds anymore where you're stringing, I mean, that's like a different experience, than anything. It's like, but sitting at a computer with some video editing software, it's so simple and intuitive that anybody can do it, and it really can inform so many things within film. And it's great that you mentioned Walter Murch, because I remember I'd only just read Walter Murch's book, I think right before I was flying down to do Your Next. And I think it was the second book that he wrote or whatever. But the thing that always struck me, the thing that always struck me about Walter Murch is that, like, in terms of like a philosophy that I think does work, it like the only one that I can think of that's consistent and plays through everything I do is Walter Murch's sort of his philosophy about the cut happening right before the actor blinks. I mean, that is totally true. I mean, like, there is a weird thing that happens where it's like a subconscious thing where the actor, like, when they're kind of done, they kind of inform where your cut is, and sometimes it can be frustrating because they might blink a little too early and you don't want to quite cut there, and sometimes you have to kind of work with that, because weirdly, if you put a cut on a blink, it really messes the cut up. It's like it's like you see it, so that is an interesting thing, and it actually is extremely consistent. I think about it all the time. I'm almost always looking for the blink, because that's as far as you can usually take that moment, or or maybe the second blink or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, like with Your Next, I don't know how I would have gotten through it if I wasn't an editor, because again, when you're dealing with low budget stuff, the biggest problem with low budget filmmaking is that you don't have access to big budget human beings, like people with the experience and the technological know-how to give you really great stuff. And so sometimes the best thing you can do as a filmmaker when you're working in a low budget, no budget realm is to hopefully be able to do a good version yourself, to rely on yourself, because you're probably not going to be able to afford to work with anybody else that, can really take it to the next level. I mean, sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you come up with people. Like on Your Next, I got very lucky because I just happened to know Andrew Palermo, who shot the movie. And this was Andrew's first feature film. He'd only done some shorts himself and some music videos and things. And now he's gone on, he just shot The Green Knight, and, he's done some really big stuff. And so, I really lucked out being just at the right place at the right time, knowing people like that. But I did not know any editors. And so for many years, I edited myself up until, relatively recently. I still edit on my movies, including on, like Godzilla, I'll do a pass, but like an internal pass. And I prefer it that way, because at a certain point, you need to work with somebody who's fast and very creative, and I like that kind of back and forth.
How did it two part one? How did it shape you to go forward, and how did it humble you going forward? Because going on to something like Godzilla versus King Kong, I mean, that's massive, but you have those roots and you have those experiences. And I know
Well, yeah, I mean,
filmmakers, you know.
yeah, I mean, I've had successes and failures, you know, just like, you know, like, and your next was kind of a mixed bag because it was very successful in its own right, you know,
Right.
Coming from nowhere with so little money in the budget. It was a success just to sell at the Lionsgate, and then it was a success just to get the theatrical engagement. But then it was kind of perceived as like a letdown because it didn't like make $100 million, you
Right.
know, which is, you know, box office is all like hype and expectation anyways. It's not really based on anything. Like every movie I've done has been a success from the perspective of that they didn't lose money, you know what I mean? But it wasn't like an overnight thing getting to Godzilla, you know, and in the last few years, I mean, you know, I came off of Blair Witch and I came off of Death Note, both of which were pretty much critically revived. And so I was kind of in a weird place where I felt like, I remember on the first day, not the first day, but like the first couple months of pre-production on Godzilla, where it's like, okay, here I am, it's like 2018, you know, at the time the movie wasn't going to be coming out till 2020. So I'm like, I know that I'm on this thing for fucking years, right? And I'm thinking to myself, you know, this is it. You know, if I blow this one, then, you know, then I'm pretty much screwed. And that's kind of a scary thing to be because you're working in such slow motion for years, you know, like I had that hanging over me for years. And I remember just being like, okay, well, I just can't think about that. I have to clear that out and just do the best job. And, you know, I'm very passionate about this thing. And so there was like an authentic passion that I knew would drive me through, and hopefully, you know, I would just survive the process. But no, I mean, it's like, I think in some ways, like the fact that Simon and I, you know, we never had like just a straight out the gate, like massive, you know, super success that propelled us forward, I think was actually really beneficial to us because it did keep us humble, and it kept us always yearning to try new things and to learn from our experiences and successes and failures, and to not, you know, buy into our own hype, you know, because I could see a version where your next comes out, makes $100 million, and we say, all right, well, we did it, you know, like, let's go do a sequel now. And then we're just kind of like, you know, just, you know, stuck in that world. And I don't know that we would have grown as much, you know, because we wouldn't have been as inclined to try new things. Like, would we have done The Guest if your next had come out right away and been a success? We probably would have been like, okay, well, we can do a movie like The Guest anytime, but we should do a sequel to your next because that's what people want. And, you know, and maybe that was the wrong choice, because then we wouldn't have been able to flex ourselves as artists and to be able to, you know, show people what we can do. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into successes and failures, and it's kind of what you make of it to a certain degree.
Yeah, it's so funny because now with Marvel putting out that What If animated series, I've read those comics for years, and it's great to see it up there, just different scenarios. But applying it to real life, you just don't know, Adam. I mean, I was supposed to talk to you last week, and we got a flood, and it wiped out half of my childhood here in Jersey, and you know, it changed my entire scope of how everything went. And who knows what the reason why I bring this stuff up is because you're also responsible, you and Sam are responsible for Barbara Crampton kind of getting back into the game, and it changed her life as well, among others. But she's one of the ones, because now she's made an entire career over the last decade of returning to the genre after being retired. So what was it like to have her and then Larry? I mean, Larry's always a staple, and they're both amazing. But what was it like to have them be a part of it?
Well, both of them were great. You know, I mean, like, just to start with Larry, I mean, I was extremely influenced by Larry's movie Habit. So, you know, in some ways it was like paying that forward, you know, because my first film, Pop Skull,
right,
which ultimately was responsible for kicking off my career and putting things in motion and ultimately leading towards your next, you know, Pop Skull was like very influenced by Habit, in the sense that Habit was like, you know, this extremely low budget movie about a vampire, and it was kind of done in the context of vampirism and alcoholism and those kind of things, and it had like a drama element to it. And Pop Skull is very similar. It was like a ghost story that kind of fused that with like a drug abuse angle and all these kind of things. You know, bringing Larry in was sort of like, okay, like I said, like paying it forward. And then Barbara, you know, it's like, you know, and I have to give Simon credit, because that was Simon's idea, because we were having a lot of trouble casting that role, and he kind of threw her out there. I don't know what made him think of her, because she wasn't really doing anything
Right.
at that point. She was basically retired. And so when we reached out to her and she said yes, it was like, oh, this will be interesting, because like because we knew we wanted like at least one of the parent roles to have that sort of horror context to it, in a fun way. And I met Tarantino at a Masters of Horror dinner like a couple years ago, and he told me a story about him watching Your Next for the first time, which Tarantino's probably my favorite living filmmaker, so this was a real delight to do anyways. But he told me this long story that kind of went nowhere ultimately, but it was just about how the whole time he watched Your Next in the theater, that he was trying to figure out who Barbara Crampton was, and it was only like kind of like towards the end of the movie that he kind of clicked it together. So like I think even he respected the fact that it was like we pulled somebody who, that's a very Tarantino, Rob Zombie thing to do. You
Right.
pull somebody from those kind of past eras
Oh,
that
yeah.
have been kind of written off, and and then you put them in a new context and reintroduce people to them again. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, now that like they're still great, they didn't go anywhere, they're still cool. So really proud of Barbara that she took that and ran with it. And I feel like that about anybody that we've worked with, that was able to parlay the experience into a full-fledged career afterwards.
That's a great story about Tarantino. And I can only imagine that you sat back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and you dreamed about these things. When you sat there with and had the picture locked for Your Next, what was your dream about where this film would go?
I mean, I think it was basically what happened with the movie. I mean, I maybe wanted it to have a bit more of a splash in the theaters, but ultimately, I can't even say that, because I think like at the time when I was actually editing the film, just the idea of getting a theatrical release was like the ultimate thing. I don't think I was even thinking beyond that at that point. In a lot of ways, it met and maybe even surpassed those expectations, because when I think about where I was as a person and a filmmaker, I mean, I was still living in Alabama when I made that film. I only moved to LA during editing of Your Next, because I was just
Wow.
here long enough where I just got my own cheap apartment. I was still like just setting up my life in a lot of ways. So the fact that the movie even existed and we were able to do anything with it it felt like a miracle. I mean, the song Looking for the Magic felt
Right.
sort of like an invocation ritual more than anything, putting in the film. Like I never saw those lyrics as being really associated to anything actually in the context of the movie itself. I thought those lyrics were kind of about like my career more than anything, like that's sort of what, ritualistically I felt like I was invoking, as I wanted to invoke a career as a filmmaker. And that's sort of what Your Next ended up doing.
I can imagine the music video of your career since then to that song, and how everything is just expanding.
I feel like it'll play at my funeral probably.
Oh, let's hope not. But anyway, one of the things you talked about, or one of the things we've talked about, is careers. And I want to go back to the antagonist for a second. And one of the things I always love is in comics how you've got you got the protagonist, the antagonist, Batman or Robin, the Spider-Man to the Green Goblin, so on and so forth. So in Your Next, that's one of the things I absolutely love, when you've got Aaron and you've got Z, and knowing that they were best friends, knowing how close they were, knowing I've read about the aspect of the casting and all that stuff. I mean, how important was that chemistry to forming them on screen? Because I think you're doing one thing that's really is continuing to be pushed, and that's having strong female characters within the film. And it's so important to have that. But a decade earlier, you see that with Your Next, especially with those two.
It was just serendipitous that Sharni and Wendy, who played a Z, were roommates. We were, again, like just like every role in the film, we were having trouble casting it, and so it was just one of those kind of serendipitous kind of things that led us there. I think for the entire group, it was important that they had a lot of chemistry because there was a lot of riffing going on in the film,
Right.
and a lot of the cast, at least like in like chunks, had kind of like in like small groups had worked with each other before. Like, you know, we brought a lot of the cast back from A Horrible Way to Die, the film Simon and I made right before it, which was, you know, Joe Swanberg, AJ Bowen, and Amy Seimetz. And so like when they're all on screen together, those scenes just cook. I mean, I think like my favorite sequence in the film is the dinner table sequence, where everybody's just in full form, and we spent a couple days shooting that thing too. But their chemistry was just really great, and like Sharni was just like, Sharni was sort of like the movie star of the group. You know, she had like the most legitimate career. She'd come off of the Step Up 3 film, and
Right.
you know, I remember her, you know, regaling us with tales about like what it was like to do a big budget movie like that. And you know, and we were all just like so like wide-eyed, like, wow, you know, like Your Next is really an ensemble film. It's characters that are literally like, you know, brothers. You know, they have to be able to build that sibling rivalry kind of thing. And we just kind of lucked out. It was like there was just sort of like this, everything sort of just came together in a really interesting way with that entire cast. And we're very fortunate, especially for a low budget movie. I mean, you know, usually like you look at low budget films and the biggest problem is that the cast don't have, like, they just feel like that they're found from different
Right.
areas. And specifically, they just seem like kind of, you know, people that are, you know, just want to be actors, and you can kind of feel that they're trying to act their way into the industry. Whereas I think we just picked a lot of interesting people who kind of like, they're not just actors, they're, you know, they're filmmakers, and, you know, and artists and that kind of stuff. And so their take on acting is going to be a little off center and a bit more interesting.
Nick Tucci was not part of that group, and he came in. If I correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, it's unfortunate, you know, his passing. I had a chance to interview him a handful of years ago, and the guy is just a spark plug. What was it like having him on set and being kind of one of the few that was not a part of that group that you formed previous to the film?
Well, he came from Keith and Jess, because they had worked with him on I think Undocumented or some movie
Yeah,
like
Chris
that.
Peckover's film. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that was a role where we were searching far and wide for an actor. And as a matter of fact, like we almost landed, like we were really close to getting a couple bigger actors for that role, and they fell through. And Keith and Jess brought up, well, there's this guy we worked with, you know, he's kind of an unknown, and but he's really great, and you know, and he's a nice guy and everything. And so we brought him in, and you know, and Nick really was like such a nice guy. Like, I mean, you know, and everybody says that about somebody who's like passed away, but like he really like was so nice. I mean, like, and he needed that because for whatever reason, those Felix and Z scenes always got pushed to the end of the schedule, and or delayed, you know.
Right.
And a more obnoxious actor would complain and make it a big problem, but he was always like, no issues at all. Like, you know, okay, we're going to shoot your scene at 4 a.m. You know, you're having to wait all night to do this, and now you're on. You know, it was like that almost like every scene with him for whatever reason. And he was always ready to go. And I remember all the girls on set had a crush on him as well. And you know, and it was because he was just a cool dude, you know. So that was kind of a really neat discovery to have.
Well, I've gotten a chance to talk with Lane and Elsie previous, but I've gotten a chance to know Elsie over the years,
Mhm.
and to see him form as a filmmaker, to see, you know, exceptionally nice guy, but
Yeah.
you know, he's definitely someone who embodies probably the worst of all the masked characters. You know, can you talk about what the costuming and the masking, you know, how those actors took it on, Simon Lane and Elsie, how they took it on and really kind of created something with it, almost like a symbiote kind of thing where they bonded to it and they were able to create something larger than life.
Yeah, well, I mean, all, you know, Elsie and Lane especially, they really understand the history of the slasher film. I mean, both of them are very obsessed with horror movies, and both of them really kind of come from, the deepest roots in my filmmaking history. I mean, LC is the one of the few actors that I worked with on my very, very first movie right out of film school called Homesick. That's how I discovered LC. Like my brother was going to Huntington College up in Montgomery, Alabama. And so my friend Evan Katz and I were casting that film. And that's like a really low budget slasher movie, and so we just went, so we didn't know where to find actors, so we just went to the theater department in Huntington, discovered LC that way. He was just this totally weird guy with a great, like, he has a very interesting body, he's like got these really long fingers, and he's got this kind of skeletal frame, just very quiet demeanor, just super fascinating guy. Whenever we were coming up with your next, I knew that I wanted him first and foremost because he just has such an interesting physique. So I knew he had to be sort of the main, the main villain in the movie, the big heavy. And then Lane was like the star of my film Popsicle again, which was like my second film. And Lane's like big obsession is Halloween. I mean, like, I remember when I think of Lane, I always think of him wearing a Halloween t-shirt. And so I was like, all right, dude, you're going to be like the Michael Myers in this movie, So obviously he's super into that. And, Halloween was a big influence, I will say, in terms of the development of the look of those characters. I mean, because obviously, like, the actual clothes they have is more of a combat thing, because these are all like kind of ex-veterans, and but they're kind of slacker veterans, but the masks themselves were created based on, like, I'd read some interviews with John Carpenter, and the way that they had come up with the Halloween mask was interesting, because it was kind of a last minute thing. Everybody knows the story about how they took the Captain Kirk mask and spray painted it white, and it created that look. And so I thought, well, if it's good enough for John Carpenter, it's good enough for us. So I knew that, like, whatever we were going to do with the masks, like Simon had written them as animal masks, and we tried a bunch of different things. We experimented with different ideas, but ultimately it felt like the animal masks were the most simplistic, straightforward idea. And I was like, well, let's take the animal mask and let's do the Halloween approach and paint them white, and give them that kind of striking kind of look to it, that ghostly quality. And but yeah, I love those guys. They did such a great job in the movie, and having Simon as one of the killers is really fun. He's the tiger mask that dies early on, and Simon's actually the only one of all of us that has his original mask from the movie, like the actual on-camera mask. And it's because we sort of have a falling out with the special effects guy on that film, and he ran off with all the props. I've seen them show up in other movies of his, but like, he ran off with all the masks. I really wish that I could have gotten a couple of those. That'd be a really great prop to own.
I have no doubt with it. And that's one of the things with the merchandising. I mean, I was able to pick this up in Chicago, and for you, were you happy? Are you happy with the way that the film's represented, with the way the fans embody it, with the merchandising, with the shirts and all? How do you feel about that?
No, I love that. I mean, I think that even when we were making the film, we were thinking like, oh, this will be a great cheap Halloween costume for people to replicate if the movie kicks on, because, at the end of the day, you can actually find those masks pretty readily. But even if you didn't, you could, make your own pretty easily, and I think that's always a good sign, like with like a horror movie, is if you can replicate the costume in a fun way.
Looking at this now, and I'm not necessarily sure how much you've been asked this, but the audio side of this film is really incredible. I mean, no doubt there's a lot of work, you're dealing with. You've talked about budget and such before, but how important was the audio component of this, the Foley, the sound, the score? I mean, what does it bring to this film? And in my perspective, elevate it?
The music was one of the things I'm on any movie I'm most excited about, and this was the first film that was going to have this type of score that I'd ever worked on. I had some friends in Alabama that I paired up with, Kyle McKinnon, Justin Lee, that came through and did an amazing job. And they created a lot of stuff ahead of time. Like some of the most memorable pieces were created beforehand so that we could draw inspiration from them. And I always find that that's really important when you're making a movie, is if you can get a couple pieces of music scored before you're filming, or even while you're filming, it really it gives you a lot of inspiration. And like, for instance, like the kind of Aaron trap theme in the film, the don don ding ding don don ding ding, like that was something that Kyle had created. Just sort of like one day he emailed me. He's like, hey, I got this new software program and I was trying it out and I put together this song. What do you think about this? And he sent it to me. And I was like, dude, I was like, we should use this in the film. And I remember showing Simon, and, but you get all these things and you don't necessarily know where you're going to use them. You have ideas of where you'd like to use them. And, but like, for instance, that one was one where at the time there wasn't a lot of like overtly electronic kind of 80s style music in anything, in that era of horror. For whatever reason, like that wasn't a thing yet. As a matter of fact, I think for a while people had kind of written off that type of music as sounding kind of cheap and cheesy. Right. At the end of the day, I didn't actually think that we were going to use that song necessarily, because I thought that, if anything, I thought the producers might reject it. And so, when it came to the editing of the movie, I remember being like, okay, we got this sequence, and I just dropped it in, and everybody fell in love with it. And so that was really fun. And then there was a couple places where, like, because Justin Lee, especially, he's this very eccentric artist in Alabama. And so at a certain point we were finishing the film, the editing of it, and Justin kind of like disappeared. And so we weren't able to get him to help us finish the score for the movie. We had a couple gaps left over. And I remember I had like kind of a deadline where I was doing a bunch of editorial stuff, like some changes, some notes, passes, and I was going to show my producers. And here I was working all night and I didn't have any new music. And this one part really needed music. It was like two sections of the film had gaps. One of them was whenever Sharni, kills the lamb mask killer. I was like sitting there and I was like, well, I got my iPod with me, and I had downloaded these like little music apps, these kind of synth apps. So I kind of created, like, just as a temporary filler in the edit, like a track for the film that plays very simplistically in the background. Right. And I remember when the producers came in, I played it for them. I thought they were going to think it was terrible, but they watched the scene and they were like, wow, that's really cool. They're like, do you think that we can get the rights to that song? Right. And I was like, yeah, I think we can. But that was actually the first moment where I also realized that I could do music, like, because I'd always kind of like around stuff. I'd never had any like real, I'd never taken classes in music or anything, but that was the first time that I was like, oh, this like this shit that I like slopped together is considered music. And so that was a big turning point for me. And I ended up making a couple tracks, with my iPod that made it in the movie, like the piece of music, for instance, that plays a couple times in the film that sounds like that kind of theme from Commando, where it's like, right. Like that was something I just made on my iPod, and so it's kind of like, it's that kind of ingenuity that I think kind of creates the specialness of a movie like Your Next, because those are kind of things where I don't know that I would do that anymore or even think to do that. So it's interesting. It doesn't matter what budget you have. Right. Sometimes the choices you make are really the production value. And
that first decade of the new millennium, Adam, all of a sudden you've got the torture porn films, you've got, torture gore films, all these different traps with the Saw franchise. Where did you and Simon go to kind of figure out what you guys wanted to do in the way of traps? Because, as the film goes on, it turns into a little bit of a Home Alone. When Sharni's character goes through there, I mean, there's all different kinds of traps there for them in the first act and then in the third act. So can you talk a little bit about, where the creative process came for how you set up that house and that location and those traps?
The Home Alone reference is a good one, because I mean, that probably represents one of the top like 10 movie going experiences in my lifetime, right up there with original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Jurassic Park, you know, The Matrix.
Of course.
You know, we enjoyed the Saw movies. Okay, you know, like I don't even think I'd seen all of them.
Right.
They weren't like totally my thing. I was never super into the torture porn thing. I really liked the Rob Zombie movies, and you know, I think that, like, you know, we were kind of riffing on our own thing. And so, like, I when it came to the traps, at least from my end, I don't remember, you know, overtly thinking about any other kind of like straightforward horror references. Like, my big reference point in terms of just the approach to the violence in general in the movie was more of the Donald Cammell film Wide of the Eye.
Okay.
You know, I don't know if you've seen that. I really like that
No.
movie, and I like how Donald Cammell shot the violent scenes. They're very poetic in a way. There's slow motion, and you know, they're all about the details of, you know, and close-ups of people's eyeballs and stuff. And even though, like, I don't think Your Next necessarily did anything that, you know, you would look at Wide of the Eye and put it next to each other and say like there's a big inspiration, but the kind of attention to detail that that movie had towards the violence was the main thing for me, where I was like, you know why this violence is interesting to watch? It's not because it's gory or gruesome. It's because it's kind of it's beautiful and unique,
Right.
and it's exciting to watch. And so I think that was more my approach. It wasn't going at it in the torture porn kind of way, where it was more about the shock value and like, can you believe that, you know, they're getting their, you know, chin ripped
Right.
off and their ears, and, you know, and there's needles going in their eyes. And, you know, it's like, it wasn't about that kind of thing, because I don't really enjoy watching that kind of stuff anyways, because it's just too extreme for me. But I do love watching violence if it's done right.
Well, we'll save that for Takashi Miike in Audition. You know what he did with the beautiful view of violence and what, and you know, the needles in the eyes. Real quick, was there ever a talk of a sequel? Did you and Simon ever sit down? What would have you done with the sequel? And then I'll let you go. What have you done with the sequel?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've talked about this in public before. I mean, like Simon had an idea for a sequel, which was about, you know, and we tried to set it up a little bit, even in the end credits. Like, there's clues about, you know, that Sharni was, her character was going to get blamed for the murders in this movie, or at least implicated within, you know, as an accomplice.
Right.
And she was going to go to jail, and the movie was going to be sort of like a fugitive story where she ends up in a meth house that's like all rigged with traps, and she's with like these other girl prisoners. And you know, I think it would have been a pretty fun idea, but I think it would have been kind of a disaster of a movie, because it's not, ultimately, when I think back to it, if we'd made that film, it's like, that's not really what Your Next is. And I think that I think it would have been fun, but I think it wouldn't have. I don't think it would have helped our careers necessarily. It probably would have been a little too gonzo and crazy, and maybe we would have also, you know, switched gears. You know, like, I mean, that's very possible. I remember, like, we almost did the 2018 Halloween movie. I mean, they're very close. I mean, like, you know, like Jason Blum had reached out to us, and you know, that was like, you know, we were in talks with them, and my take on that was going to be completely different. It wouldn't have been the Jamie Lee Curtis version, and that one also would have been a fucking disaster, because I think that's what people wanted, is the Jamie Lee Curtis version. But similarly, when, like, you know, we're talking about what if scenarios, you know, I think back to that, and I'm like, similarly to probably what would have happened with Your Next, is this would have been the idea we would have started with, and then we probably would have gone in a different direction once we developed it, and maybe it would have turned into something different. Also, we probably would have been like, oh, we can't afford to do this big fugitive thing, and then we would have had to figure it out, you know, because that's what movie making is. It's not just like, okay, I want to do this and here we go. It's like, okay, here's my idea, and now here's the reality of what I can afford and do and pull off. And then it's a melding of those things, and then that steers you in different directions as you go.
Adam, I can't thank you enough for the time you've given me to talk about Your Next. And
thank you very much. Great talking to you.